Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Linton, President of the Colorado Motor Vehicle Dealer Board. Today's date is March 16th, 2021, and the time is 9:03 a.m. I will be presiding over this emergency rulemaking hearing in accordance with Section 24.4.1036A of the Colorado Revised Statutes. These proceedings are being recorded as is standard practice of the board. Notice of this emergency rulemaking meeting was announced via an agenda notice issued on March 10th, 2021. As noticed in the agenda, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and emergency, this meeting is being held virtually using Cisco WebEx and is accessible to the public. At this time, I request that the board members, the executive secretary, and the representative from the Colorado Attorney General's office identify themselves for the record, starting with the board members, and I'll just go down the list. Mr. Flower? Here. Thank you. Let me, I guess, start at the top. Ms. Bumgard is not with us today, and Ms. Behrens is not on the call at this point, nor is Ms. Bode. Mr. Porter? Mr. Porter, are you there? This will come back to him. Mr. Shaughnessy? Here. Thank you. Mr. Walsh? I'm here. And Mr. Whithelm? I'm here. Thank you. And is Mr. Porter on?
Yes, I am now. Figured out how to turn the speaker on.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Porter. And then the executive secretary, please.
Yes, sir, I am present.
Thank you. And representative from the Colorado Attorney General's office.
Yes, this is Bradford Jones from the Colorado Attorney General's office in representation of the board on this matter.
Thank you. I've determined that a quorum of the board is present, so it's possible to proceed. Specifically, during this emergency rulemaking hearing, the board will consider the repeal of two current emergency rules that the board promulgated on November 17th, 2020, and are set to expire tomorrow, March 17th, 2021. The first one is Motor Vehicle Rule number 4420-102-22, COVID dial. And the second one is Power Sports Vehicle Rule number 4420-402-17, COVID dial. The board will also consider the promulgation and adoption of the following emergency rules. Motor Vehicle Rule number 4420-102-22, COVID dial second edition, and Power Sports Vehicle Rule number 4420-402-17, COVID dial second edition. At this time, I would like to call for a motion to open the hearing to consider the repeal of the two current emergency rules and a promulgation of two new proposed emergency rules related both to 1 CCR 205-1 regarding motor vehicles and to 1 CCR 205-2 regarding power sports vehicles. Is there a motion to open the emergency rulemaking hearing?
This is Mr. Flower.
I move to open the emergency rulemaking session.
I believe there's a motion from Mr. Shaughnessy. Do we have a second?
I would second Mr. Flower.
Thank you. And a second by Mr. Flower. All in favor? Mr. Porter? Mr. Porter? We'll come back to Mr. Porter. Mr. Walsh?
Yes.
And Mr. Whithelm?
Yes, Mr. Whithelm.
Thank you. And Mr. Porter? Looks like he's having some trouble. I guess, Mr. Jones, how would you like to proceed?
Mr. Porter, are you there?
Mr. Porter's calling in on a cell phone. I tried to unmute him.
Mr. Porter, are you there?
Mr. President, you can cast your vote since Mr. Porter is having technical difficulties, and just indicate who's abstaining from this portion of the rulemaking.
Okay. So I also vote to open the rulemaking hearing. This motion passes unanimously with Mr. Porter abstaining. Due to the emergency nature of these proposed emergency rules, this hearing will proceed in accordance with Section 24-4-1036A CRS and is not subject to the requirements under subsection 3 and 4 of that statutory provision. At this time, I will turn the hearing over to Chris Rouse, Executive Secretary to the Board and the Director of the Auto Industry Division, to provide an overview and background for the emergency rules. Ms. Rouse.
Good morning, board members, staff, and distinguished guests. This rulemaking meeting and hearing is to consider the adoption of two emergency rules, 4420-102 COVID dial and 4420-402 17 COVID dial. Since this meeting is being held virtually, anybody in the audience that wishes to participate will have an opportunity. There is a raise your hand function, and Ms. Hartman will be able to move you over so that you're able to speak to the board and give testimony if you so desire. The COVID pandemic continues, and the need for the emergency rules surrounding operations during the pandemic remains. The board promulgated emergency rules in November. Those two emergency rules will naturally expire tomorrow. Therefore, we are going to propose that we repeal the current two emergency rules and replace them with two new emergency rules. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Rouse. Do the board members have any questions for Ms. Rouse before we proceed? All right. Hearing none. If there's anyone from the public. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was having problems with the mute. This is Mr. Whithelm. Just to clarify for the record, when Ms. Rouse read in the record, I don't know if it matters, but we didn't denote that the proposed rules would be second edition. Is that important to note for the record?
So, Mr. Wildhelm, this is Mr. Jones from the Colorado Attorney General's office. At this time, you're not calling for a vote. Ms. Rouse was just providing background. I can answer the question regarding the second edition. The COVID dial, the rules have been based on the information that has been put out by the governor's office in accordance. CDPHE is also, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has also issued public health orders. And we're following the format of how they describe the latest public health orders based on the executive orders. And it is still the COVID dial, which was instituted last November. And that is the reason that second edition is listed as opposed to a new name. But that can be distinguished at the time that the board votes on each of the rules. So there's going to be 4 votes, 2 to repeal the existing rules, and then 2 to promulgate the new emergency rules, 1 for motor vehicle and 1 for power sports.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Any other questions from board members?
So essentially, these two rules are the same. They just, one is for the motor vehicle dealers and one is for power sports. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions from board members? Okay. If there's anyone from the public who wishes to testify, please speak up. Please make sure to state your full name and the name of the organization, if any, that you are appearing on behalf of. Please attempt to limit your comments to 5 minutes. Does anyone wish to speak?
I do not have any raised hands.
Okay, great. Then we will proceed. At this time, I'd like to call for a motion to close the public comment phase of the hearing, consider the repeal of the 2 current emergency rules and the promulgation of the 2 new proposed emergency rules related both to 1 CCR 205-1 regarding motor vehicles and to 1 CCR 205-2 regarding power sports vehicles. Is there a motion to close the public comment phase of the rulemaking hearing?
This is Mr. Whithelm. I motion that we close the public comment phase.
This is Luke Walsh. I'll second that.
Thank you. We have a motion by Mr. Whithelm and a second by Mr. Walsh. All in favor? Mr. Flower?
Yes.
Mr. Porter?
Yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. The public comment phase of the rulemaking hearing is now closed. No further comments from the public or the division will be allowed without explicit recognition by the chair of this hearing. The board will now begin the deliberation phase of this emergency rulemaking hearing. The deliberation phase is open to the public, but only board members and the Attorney General representative are permitted to participate unless the chair authorizes someone else to speak. Since there are 2 current emergency rules and 2 proposed emergency rules, each rule will have to be voted on separately. Additionally, due to the emergency nature of these rules, the board must also vote to approve the statement of justification for each of the 2 proposed emergency rules in accordance with section 24.103(6)(a). Before I call for motions on these emergency rules, do any of the board members have any comments on the 2 current emergency rules and/or the 2 proposed new emergency rules before we begin? All right, hearing none. Do I have a motion to repeal current emergency regulation 4420-102-22-COVID dial previously promulgated on November 17th, 2020?
This is Mr. Whithelm. I make a motion that we repeal emergency regulation 4420-102, parents 22, COVID dial.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
I would second that, Mr. Flower.
And a second by Mr. Flower. Any further discussion? All in favor? Mr. Porter?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
And Mr. Walsh?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Do I have a motion to repeal current emergency regulation 4420-402-17 COVID dial previously promulgated on November 17th, 2020?
This is Mr. Shaughnessy. I'd make a motion to repeal emergency regulation 4420-402, 17 COVID
Thank you, Mr. Shaughnessy. Do we have a second?
This is Luke Walsh. I'll second that.
Thank you. We have a motion by Mr. Shaughnessy and a second by Mr. Walsh. Any further discussion? All in favor, Mr. Flower?
Yes.
Mr. Porter?
Yes.
And Mr. Whithelm?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Do I have a motion to adopt the proposed emergency regulation 4420-102-22 COVID dial second edition and authorize me as the president of the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board to sign the statement of emergency justification and adoption concerning emergency regulation 4420-102-22 COVID dial second edition?
This is Mr. Whithelm. I'll make a motion to accept and adopt emergency regulation 4420-102, parents 22, COVID dial second edition. And if I can, in the same motion, make a motion that we accept the statement of justification for said rule.
And Mr. Weltham, this is Mr. Jones from the Colorado Attorney General's office. Do you also want to delegate to Mr. Linton as the president of the board to sign that statement of emergency justification and adoption?
Yes, I would.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a motion by Mr. Whithelm. Do we have a second?
It's Mr. Shaughnessy. I'll second.
And a second by Mr. Shaughnessy. Any further discussion? All in favor, Mr. Flower?
Yes.
Mr. Porter?
Yes.
And Mr. Walsh?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Do I have a motion to adopt the proposed emergency regulation 4420-402, 17, COVID dial, second edition, and authorize me as the president of Motor Vehicle Dealer Board to sign the statement of emergency justification and adoption concerning emergency regulation 4420-402, 17, COVID dial, second edition? Is there a motion to adopt?
This is Mr. Whithelm. I'd make a motion to adopt emergency regulation 4420-402, parent 17, COVID dial, second edition, and authorize you as the president of the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board to sign that document, and also accept the statement of justification for the proposed rule as well.
Thank you, Mr. Whithelm. We have a motion for Mr. Whithelm. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Go ahead.
And a second by Mr. Flower. Any further discussion? All in favor, Mr. Porter?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Shaughnessy.
Yes.
Thank you, and Mr. Walsh?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, members of the board. Mr. Jones, do you have anything else to add before we proceed?
Members of the board and members of the public, this is Mr. Jones from the Colorado Attorney General's office. Under the Article 4 of Title 24, these rules are now in effect as emergency rules, and they are in effect for 120 days unless they are repealed or amended before the end of that time. The two former now emergency rules that were promulgated in November are no longer in effect, and they're repealed immediately. So the new rules that are now in effect as of today's date for 120 days are emergency regulation 4420-102, subsection 22, COVID dial, second edition, and emergency regulation 4420-402, parent 17, COVID dial, second edition. With that, thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. We've reached the conclusion of this emergency rulemaking hearing. I'd like to thank the board members and everyone else who has participated in the process today. At this time, I'd like to call for a motion to close the hearing.
This is Mr. Whithelm. I move we close the hearing.
I have a motion by Mr. Whithelm. Do we have a second?
It's Mr. Shaughnessy, I'll second.
And a second by Mr. Shaughnessy. All in favor, Mr. Flower?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Porter.
Yes.
Thank you, and Mr. Walsh.
Yes.
Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. I declare the rulemaking hearing closed. Now, at this point, we will move to our normal meeting. The time is 9:22 a.m.